Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to start a sort of a series in terms of my videos, and in these videos I'd like to talk about vintage watches which I think as a group or as a model or a brand are particularly good value at the present time on the vintage market. So in this video I'd like to talk about a few watches under the £500 mark, and which at the moment are excellent value in terms of vintage watches, and in this case all vintage mechanical wristwatches, both from Japanese brands and Swiss brands alike. Now the first watch which I'd like to talk about is the Seiko 6138, and this is a watch which was very, very notable in the 70s and was made by Seiko themselves with an in-house chronograph movement. And in this case it is a column wheel chronograph with a vertical clutch mechanism, making this watch an interesting model in terms of having quite an advanced movement, especially for the price that one can get these watches for these days, where for one of these bicompact chronographs with the day and the date, one can pay between £200 and £400, which I personally think is remarkable for an in-house chronograph movement. Now fundamentally, when one looks for these watches on the internet in terms of purchasing these watches, there are really two styles of watches that are clearly visible, although there are versions with different styles of bezels. But fundamentally there are versions with circular subdials, and then the ones that are called kakume, or square eyes in Japanese, which are these versions with square subdials, in a style which is somewhat reminiscent of 70s Tudors. But nonetheless, I do think that both versions are interesting, depending on what style of chronograph one likes more. Now, the case dimensions of this watch do make this watch more suited to people with larger wrists, and notably this watch is effectively 43 by 44 millimeters, depending on how one measures the case. So 43 millimeters in diameter, and then 44 from lug to lug. So it's a large watch that's quite top heavy. So whereas it has quite a short lug to lug distance, which means that a narrow wrist technically should be able to take it, the heft of this watch would make the watch difficult to wear for someone with a smaller, more dainty wrist. This issue is somewhat magnified by the fact that the lugs are 18mm across, while the case is 14mm thick on these watches, meaning that they are quite top-heavy as well as being broad and quite heavy stainless steel watches. But I do think in terms of appearance, the case, the way that it's brushed with these large polished bevels, actually breaks up the size of this watch very well, and the fact that the crown is somewhat shielded and protected by the case itself and its inset into the case means that actually this watch is wearable for those with smaller wrists, as long as one takes into account the fact the watch is quite thick and quite heavy on the wrist. I think though the real beauty of this watch is the fact that you are getting an in-house movement with these watches, which come in at a great variation of different styles, from very sedate black dials through to bright blues and oranges, which play off that 70s vibe much better. But certainly whichever model of this watch one buys, one certainly is getting a watch which would be able to compete in the day with a great deal of Swiss watches, but these Swiss watches have now reached prices around the £1,500 to £2,000 mark, while this watch has remained at £200 to £400, making this watch a truly tremendous purchase for anyone in the market for one of these. Now the next watches, which are also from Seiko, which I'd like to talk about, are the King Seikos. Now, in 1961, King Seiko was a separate division of Seiko from Grand Seiko, and effectively this was a separate factory which competed directly against Grand Seiko for the higher tier of Seiko watches. So this watch competed with the Omega Seamaster of the time, as it did with the various Longines Conquests, which are also incidentally in this video because one can find them for such incredible values, but I'll get onto those in just a moment. But it would seem that there is a real lack of interest in vintage wristwatches around this 35 to 40mm size in a dress style, and these King Seikos have very much been the victim of those. Whereas these have very much the highest tier of Seiko technology of the era, there really isn't much demand for them. And effectively what one is able to get with one of these watches is, for under £500, a stainless steel case, finished in that particular manner that Seiko do, with many facets to their cases while retaining a very elegant air to this dress watch. And of course King Seikos come in various shapes and sizes, from manually wound to automatic versions. But what one does find is that a great deal of these watches are high beat movements, varying between 28,800 beats per hour and 36,000 depending on the model. But either way, this is quite an interesting touch for a Seiko, because of course most Seikos run at 21,600 beats per hour, which is substantially less than these higher beat models, which sell these days for around £350 to £500. Obviously, if one aims for a gold model, then they do cost more. But for a steel model, one is able to get hold of one of these watches for this quite remarkable price. With these watches, one is also able to enjoy the elegance of those beautiful sunburst silver dials, with again very elegant Dauphine hands, and a very simple yet very well considered dial arrangement, with indices usually. One occasionally finds versions with numerals, but more often than not with very simple indices, which I think work extraordinarily well to make these watches look very timeless. And unlike a lot of other vintage watches, these wristwatches don't look very much set in their era, but rather can be worn in any situation really, due to the fact that they look so versatile. Of course, it is worth pointing out that these watches did directly compete with watches from Rolex, Longines and Omega from the era, which were very much high-end watches of the era. And I do appreciate that Longines have, in some people's words, slipped from that era of really high-quality watches, and they still do make beautiful watches, but I think the perception of the brand was higher back then, and certainly this watch did compete with those and succeeded until the quartz crisis, when King Seiko effectively went bankrupt as a section of the Seiko brands due to the fact that they weren't selling watches the way they should have been, in the same quantities as they would need to support themselves. But apart from the quartz crisis, these watches were very much the high tier of dress watches, making them an incredible buy if one can get hold of one for this £350 to £500 mark. Of course, the one truly obvious alternative to that beautiful King Seiko is an Omega Seamaster from the 1950s and 60s. And the Omega Seamaster has always been quite an iconic watch, but it's true that the value and interest in the dress watches as of late has been dropped immensely in favour of people being more keen on the sports models, notably the 300, or even the 200 from the 80s. So one really has reached a point where actually one can get hold of a model of Seamaster or Seamaster Calendar, one of the early dress watches, in truly fantastic nick. In terms of dials, obviously the cases will have picked up scratches, but in terms of dial quality and movement, finish and condition, one can pick up a good model for between £300 and £500. Of course, the finishing on these watches is superb, as will be expected from these Omegas, which were true luxury models of the era, with very beautifully finished gold hands and indices around the dial, or numerals depending on the model. But one can find some very interesting pieces with very curious case designs, but case designs which are very, very true to the Seamaster in terms of its design, notably those lugs which jutted out ever so slightly from the case before distancing themselves and attaching to the strap, which gives an attractive yet slightly 50s style to these watches, which is of course true to the era they were made. But certainly when a great deal of watches go for a far more simple aesthetic, the Seamaster does stand out as having a very different case design. What I find is most remarkable about these watches, though, is the fact that for a brand like Omega, and I don't usually like to talk about the brand of watches as being an advantage, because I do feel that this gives certain brands an unfair advantage over others to produce a high-quality item. But in terms of this watch, it is remarkable that one can get hold of one of these for the price they are, £300 to £500, or more if one wants to go for a particularly beautiful model, but they are perfectly accessible within this price point. One can have a watch which will be serviced, and one can be sure will be serviced very well by the brand, which is something which, well, it's not something that can be said for a great deal of brands that have gone out of business since this era, meaning that servicing is more of a difficult job, whereas here one can go to the brand directly and have the watch serviced, especially at this price. This is really an anomaly in terms of watches one can buy in the vintage market. Additionally, these watches do have in-house movements, which are very much a plus in terms of being Swiss in-house movements, which do generally keep extremely good time. And it's worth saying the Seamaster, unlike things like the Deville or the Genève, which came after this watch, this watch was designed to be a semi-sports watch, if you will. So a watch which was by no means as rugged as, for example, the Seamaster 300, or even the Railmaster, but was designed to be a watch that one could wear on most occasions without having to worry too much about the watch. Notably, it had a case that was water resistant, as well as quite robust lugs and a robust case design, which, while appearing very dressy these days with their mid-30mm cases, so 35, 36, I've even seen some 33mm models, but generally they do come around the 35 to 38mm sizes. They are more robust than other watches of the era in terms of dress watches, making them a very interesting proposition for someone who wants a dress watch which can be worn on most occasions. Before I move on to the next watch on this list, it's also worthwhile pointing out that Omegas from this era weren't plated. They were all stainless steel, or gold-plated, or gold. So if one goes for a steel model, one can be sure that it's not a plated base metal, but rather a proper stainless steel case which won't corrode or wear down over the years, which is a real plus when some watches from, for example, Breitling, one has to be very careful with to find a model which is in fact stainless steel in its entirety from that era. Now the next watch which I'd like to talk about is a Swiss chronograph of sorts, and this is the Omega Chronostop, which is a watch which is quite an oddity. Now the curious aspect about this watch is the fact that it has a chronograph integrated into a very simple dial design. And the purpose of this watch was fundamentally to time driving events between two nearby places, so it allowed you to time very short periods of time with an uncluttered dial. And this is why this watch is actually available in several versions, one where the watch is the dial is placed upright in the watch, while the other way the dial is placed sideways, so as if you have the watch on the inside of your wrist, and you are driving with your hand on the steering wheel, you are able to read the time very easily, which is a very interesting style of watch and makes it difficult to use on a daily basis, but certainly makes it a very interesting talking piece. Now the movement inside this watch is an Omega caliber, whereby when you press that pusher at the 230 position or 215 position, the chronograph hand will engage, which is that orange second hand, and this watch has no second hand otherwise. So this engages, and this will time for as long as you have it engaged, but there is no timer for the minutes, so you have to judge how many minutes you've been timing for. However, the oddity of this watch comes when one presses down that pusher the second time to stop the chronograph. One in fact has to keep one's finger down on it while one reads the time, because when it's released it resets automatically, and this was designed so that you could time things very quickly and with very short intervals between timing periods, which is a curious concept, and I haven't seen another watch like this at all. And it's housed in this very 70s, despite the fact that this watch came out just before the 70s, a style of tonneau case, which does mirror other models in both the Flightmaster, Speedmaster and Seamaster lines of watches. This watch also features one of the dials which one probably wouldn't be able to find on any other model for this sort of price, which is a racing style of dial, where one has those two styles of second indices around the edge of the dial on that second track, which sit on two different levels to form a sort of checkered flag around the dial. Now I personally think this look is tremendous, and it is an acquired taste, but I certainly think this is the least expensive Omega model which one can get with this particular detail. Also, the beautifully twin-levelled style of dial is a real beauty to behold on this watch. Now the price of one of these very interesting sports watches in this stainless steel manually wound guise comes in at around the £500 mark, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more, but generally around this price point, which makes these chronographs from Omega superb value for money when one considers the other options, notably the Speedmaster, which admittedly is a much more complex watch. It would be a mistake to compare them together, because of course they are so different. But when one compares, they are both chronographs in the Omega lineup, and the price of Speedmasters is ever growing. It is remarkable to find a watch like this for the price they sell at. Now the final watch which I'd like to talk about is the Morton Conquest from the 1950s and 60s. And of course this is a watch which has been recaptured in the form of the Conquest Heritage made recently by Longines. But I must say, in many respects, the original watch was a superior timepiece. Of course, it pains me to say this, owning a Longines Conquest Heritage. But nonetheless, I do think these are tremendous watches for the price, and these watches tend to come in around the £400 to £500 mark in steel. And these watches are effectively appealing to the same market as the Omega Seamaster, which I showed you earlier on in the video. These are robust dress watches for those who want a watch for every situation. Like the Seamaster, these watches are also water resistant or waterproof, as they stated back then, and with a beautiful enamel medallion on the back of the case to show for this, with a fish in a green enamel. The case is very much a product of its era, and with a similar design to the Seamaster, though with less pronounced lugs, and also these watches had dials which were very, very carefully made to have a very distinct, different finish around the ring of those applied indices, which breaks this watch up and gives it a semi-sunburst effect on some parts of the dial, while having a brushed effect on other parts, which gives an all-round, extremely elegant and very high-quality finish. The curious aspect, really, about this watch is the fact that it approaches that market of a robust dress watch very differently to the Seamaster. Whereas the Seamaster has a very strong, very reliable movement, and the Longines does too, but not to the same level as the Omega. The Longines, they've put a great deal more care into the dial finishing and the general case finish than the Omega, in my opinion. Notably, that medallion on the caseback, which I mentioned, is a beautiful touch, with a green enamel on the caseback, which truly is something that isn't seen these days, and is something which I would like to see more on watches, but certainly is something that Longines did extraordinarily well with this timepiece. Of course, for the price of £400 to £500, these watches truly are a steal, in terms of timepieces of this type. Also, it's worth noting that if one is in the market for something slightly more expensive, around the £800 to £1,000 mark, then the solid 18-karat gold models of this watch are fantastic options too, because often they're found in better condition than the steel versions, as they're generally treated a little bit less roughly, although generally the steel versions are available in models with a great deal of hairline scratches but very few deep bumps, which means they can be restored very easily. Anyway, I will conclude the video here, though there are other fantastic options on the market, which I'll no doubt talk about in a subsequent video. But I thought these watches were some of the best ones that are currently on the market, in terms of their prices and availability. So anyway, thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe if you did enjoy this video and would like to see more content on the channel in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.